So, an update on various news articles that I'd consider war propaganda that I've noticed. Uh, I've noticed there is some talk in Western military circles in a way that I would associate with propaganda about changing the war objective from status quo antebellum, that is the situation before 2014, which is their stated objective, to making sure that Russia will be incapable of doing damage to anybody else again, which is basically saying that they want a mad outcome because that is the same as counter value nuclear force. The wording is the same. So that would be the Western side doing its nuclear threats. Now, on the Eastern side, we've seen the Russians, including Putin, make the argument that they are just taking back what is rightfully theirs and they are entitled to the Baltic and Eastern Europe and Finland and Ukraine and Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and all those countries. They're making the claim that they're entitled to those regions, which is frankly, in terms of military power projection, impossible to enforce without mobilization. So we've seen some Russian arguments for mobilization. So both sides are seeming to amp up the word war, which to me signals that the ground war is not solving their questions, which means both sides might end up pouring more resources and effort into the ground war in an effort to get the outcome they prefer. Both sides seem to be, roughly speaking, doing tit for tat. Neither side seems to be having a much greater ability on the field, which speaks to the attacker being bogged down because the attacker in this situation is expecting a much greater victory than they got. But it does seem on the ground war level that the governmental district, which you'd call state, of Donbass, Kherson, and the ones in between, and that's still 4 states out of the around 20 that Ukraine is made up of, will fall to the Russians. But as far as the rest are concerned, they most likely will not. That is because the Ukrainians have seemed to take a stance of not putting up a strong fight in regions where there is a large ethnic Russian population. Like Kiev, that is predominantly Ukrainian, they were able to hold relatively easily. So too with the large city up north, which I can't remember right now, they were also able to actually helps if I have a map open here. This is all very cumbersome, so many clicks, and then there's a little box somewhere that says click here to get to this thing immediately. So they're going to most likely get this region. Kharkiv, while it has a strong Russian population, seemed large enough to be able to successfully resist the Russians on its own. And Kharkiv kind of controls the entire north of the country, so holding it was pretty important. While there's a lot of cities in the south that are each holding their little piece and their defense was piecemeal. But in the north, it seemed to focus first on Kiev, while Kharkiv and a lot of cities in the east were surrounded. And then once it was clear that Kiev is going to hold, then the Russians deployed mostly to Mariupol, Donetsk, and Luhansk, while the Ukrainians deployed to Kharkiv. And they were able to push the Russians back to the border in Kharkiv and even do some limited long distance strikes on Belgorod. And they weren't able to hold Kherson in the south, the Ukrainians, but they were able to hold Mykolaiv, which means that the Russians will probably not get west of the Dnieper much, which seems to me to mean that these parts roughly have the pro-Russian population. They're not even currently able to threaten Zaporizhzhia or Dnipro, but they'll get there eventually. But they are very unlikely within 6 months, 3 to 6 months minimum, to get to Odessa. So it seems unlikely. Currently, the battle is around here, where the Ukrainians have a spear tip towards, or bridgehead towards, the last parts of the Luhansk governmental state or district or whatever. And if they lose it, they lose the entirety of the Luhansk state, so they're putting up a strong fight. While Donetsk state still has large parts in the west that are controlled by the Ukrainians, so they're fighting a delaying battle. Kherson, I believe there are tiny parts that are still technically Ukrainian, but I'm not sure. And same with this district, and Mykolaiv district seems mostly Ukrainian. In the starting parts of the war, they were expecting to take Kiev, but the Ukrainians actually fought back pretty tenaciously, which kept Kiev from falling. So they withdrew north and took the roads and landed in this region, while the Ukrainians landed here and somewhat here. So it seems this region, from a Ukrainian standpoint, has the maximum feasible amount of defenders, and putting more will only stress the supply, so they went for Kharkiv instead. The Russians are starting to field old tanks, as we knew they would, because they have a stockpile, an enormous stockpile of 70s era tanks. And these are mostly used in like logistics and stuff that isn't like immediately on the front line, and they're used actually as mobile artillery instead of breakthrough tanks as we'd understand it. That's why the Russian artillery advantage, according to the Ukrainian defenders, is 10-1, because the Russians have the ability to use their old tanks as artillery weapons. It's still a pretty sizable mobile artillery platform with a pretty good gun. And if you do modernizations, you may be able to modernize a significant number of the tanks before the war is over. And at the same time, if you're building modern tanks, you'll have something of a okay outcome. Now, the Ukrainians are getting an increasing amount of aid from the West, but there have already been signs of war exhaustion in the West, where there is some discussion of not helping as much, or preference to the Russians having a peace or so, but they are still fairly minor. The main point seems to be the Western talk of escalating this into a situation where the Russians cannot do a similar thing again, which to me seems like the classic mad outcome. So I feel a little ambivalent about it. I do not like talk like that unless you are willing to go through nuclear war, which I believe we are not. I believe. And seems like if this war continues without Russia mobilizing, that the Ukrainians will be able to hold west of Dnieper, with the exception that Kherson might still actually fall to the Russians. they'll be able to hold Dnipro or Zaporizhzhia, probably not both, and they'll be able to hold Kharkiv, but we'll see if the Russians make another push through the north, if they lose areas like Chernihiv or Sumy, if this becomes an exchange of territory instead of an exchange of government. The Russians are using artillery to indiscriminately shell residential areas, and sometimes the Ukrainians have done the same. But judging by the number of reports, it seems the Russians are doing it more. So, what I am most worried about is the Russian statements of interest in returning the Russian Empire, which has historically consumed Finland. So, I would be worried about that. I'm not really worried about a Ukrainian collapse because as the Russian supply lines draws deeper into Ukraine, the Ukrainian civilian population will do more and more persistent guerrilla attacks, and those will eventually make the supply situation for the Russians untenable. There is a limit as to how far into Ukraine they can actually proceed, even if the army is mostly defeated, the Ukrainian army. But further than right now, if they continue to push, yes, they will take Luhansk, Donetsk, probably south and east of Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro, and probably Kherson. And then they'll be able to re-threaten Kharkiv, but it won't happen yet. I would assume, based on not wanting to lengthen their front line, that while they might be threatening Mykolaiv, they're in no position to take Mykolaiv, and they will not take Kharkiv yet. They will first do strong concentrated pushes from the east all the way to the Dnieper, and as well as from the south. And then once they have the Dnipro and the main crossings over to the Dnieper in the center part of the country, they'll reorganize to take Kharkiv from south and north, which is why some of their units are in reserve in Belgorod, which is in the media. So they will focus on taking a wide front and taking all along on the wide front a flexible defense pattern, and then focus most of their effort on a single point in the front and have a domino feel to the front, whereby they knock out target after target to get to their objective one by one. Right now, the objective is to take all of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, hold Kherson, threaten Mykolaiv, hold probably Zaporizhzhia. Once Donetsk and Luhansk falls, they'll go from Zaporizhzhia to Dnipro, and from those two republics towards Kharkiv, but they won't make it evident that they're threatening Kharkiv immediately. They will advance roughly along the front, but they won't make it clear that they're making their second push on Kharkiv, I think, based on what I've seen. is what they hold of the Luhansk Oblast, I think. As you can see, threaten but do not take Mykolaiv. Hold Kherson. Make sure the Ukrainians are tied down in the south, making it look like discussion that your objective is Odessa and Transnistria. If absolutely all fails, hold the canal, which keeps the waterway to Crimea open. Focus along the front bulge of the Ukrainian front to get Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro, or at least block their usability in supplying Kharkiv. Hold the areas within striking distance of Kharkiv, but do not entrench yourself for a battle yet. Make the Ukrainians fight on disadvantageous ground. And this was the initial attempt to get Kiev, but these have all withdrawn. They threatened Kiev with enough to show that if they take it now, it will turn into a field of rubble. So this has to be solved elsewhere. So right now, the fighting is clearly on the little bridgehead into the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. After that, it's going to be pushing from there to the Dnieper. They could try to blockade that unit or like multi that unit by taking Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro now. But then they would be in a very large pocket, which the Russians have no way of reducing. It would be a fortification battle of epic proportions. So right now they want to roll the enemy line instead of forcing it into a direct confrontation. That seems to be the plan, which means the Ukrainians are in their pre-prepared defensive positions against an enemy that uses artillery superiority. So they're withdrawing ahead of every artillery barrage and digging in again and then withdrawing. So the losses are relatively minor, but they are getting losses. The Ukrainians have clearly not adapted deep strikes and multi-warfare into their doctrine. It's clear. They are playing a very strong, determined defense, but it is along Russia's predicted advance route. So both sides are bashing their head into the attrition war, and Ukraine is smaller. But Ukraine is betting that they can mobilize while Russia cannot. A dangerous idea, but we'll see how it pays off for them. They're betting that if Russia mobilizes, the West will actually join in to help Ukraine with actual military boots on the ground, while they're betting that Russia's kind of like pride won't allow them to mobilize, will want to show that the professional Russians can take care of the Ukrainian ragtag oligarchs and Nazis, which is why Russia is a little against mobilizing. I have seen a lot of articles where they laugh about the effectiveness of the 70s era tanks that Russia is modernizing, but it's not that bad comparing to Russian modern day architecture. It is worse, but even some Russian modern tanks have the same faults as the 70s era tanks. So the difference between a modernized tank that has out of 10,000 moving parts, 3 fatal design flaws, if it's an absolutely modern tank, and a modernized 70s tank that has out of 1,000 moving parts, 7 fatal flaws. It's not that big a deal, but it is a big deal. Gunpower wise, there's nothing the Ukrainians feel that the 70s era Russian tanks in coordination with any kind of air support can't take out. So the Ukrainians got to, they can occasionally do small unit tank actions, but they can't do like an armored core of tanks. One of the best Ukrainian units, which is actually here, is a mechanized brigade. You will notice, based on the Russian activities on the front, that they use battalions instead of brigades or divisions, while the Ukrainians roughly use brigades. It means that there's constant low-level reports of Russian failures because the unit sizes are the only things where failure is interesting. And Russian unit size is 1/10 of Ukrainian unit size, but even counting that, the Russians have more stuff. So you see stuff like Battalion X surrendering to the Ukrainians 5 times a month, while you see Brigade Y of Ukrainians surrendering to the Russians once a month. And you assume the Ukrainians are getting more surrenders than the Russians. There are certain things that the Russians have done to obfuscate their line, to appear like they're not appearing. That's one of the reasons why you need to see a lot of war firsthand, which is where computer games with war in their topic becomes good. You see certain things on movement maps. That's why you need the actual field training. So here is the city that is by these couple of bridges, which have all blown, and these guys on the eastern side of the thing are trying to fight a defensive battle, but they can't get out of the pocket because those bridges have been blown. They got most likely cut off somewhere in the east here while the Russians were storming through those bridges and the Ukrainians blew them. So it's once again a little bit of a surrounded situation for the Ukrainians. They're getting them because the Russians have mobility, air power, and other advantages, but they're not getting as many as I thought they might. Here, I think, is the Oblast border. Yeah, here's the Oblast border. Once this pocket falls, which might take 3 weeks, 2 weeks, then the entirety of the Luhansk and Donetsk states are within Russian control. Then they might start annexation proceedings, give them Russian passports, remove local passports, currency units, etc., annex them. Everybody speaks Russian, or you have an interpreter who speaks Russian, or you get shot. Then they will, I'm thinking these guys on the west side of the river don't want to withdraw because they're trying to give the guys on the east side of the river some chance of getting out. Once it starts to go into a withdrawal, I think they might go into Sloviansk, maybe even Bakhmut. But this pocket has to be withdrawn from fairly quickly. If the Russians have taken a significant enough reserve here, they could easily punch through this and surround that entire pocket. That's too dangerous. Too dangerous. Then this distance is maybe 2 months of fighting, maybe even 3. But during that time, the Ukrainians might be able to take Kherson, but there's no way they'll be able to threaten the canal. And they might be able to take a little bit of ground in the north around Kharkiv, but there's no way Kharkiv can at that point be considered safe yet. So it's gonna be 6 months until we see if, after the Russians have taken all the easy to take pro Russian regions of Ukraine, if they can take a large city that's actually Russian populated but pro Ukrainian very strongly. If they can take Kharkiv, then there is a possibility that they will reconsider taking Kiev. But I think they'll want Kharkiv as a test case first because it's the only city in the east that's large enough to properly simulate urban warfare. The Russians are taking this little dumbly because they're expending their manpower instead of, like you should be doing, having enough fresh recruits in, train their fresh recruits at a greater rate than your loss ratio. So they're actually expending instead of gaining manpower in war. You should always be both training and gaining manpower in a war because you're expanding the number of people from your country that can now serve in the military by making economic changes into the structure of your country. After 3-4 months of fighting, we're at roughly 3 months. Every person in the Russian professional army should have had a few weeks of field experience. So you can draft 20% of your total field army in a single day and put them with the guys who know the field routine and they'll sort it out. Your training period and a few other characteristics will change dramatically. So I have, there's one more match. Besides taking Transnistria would have the vast added this benefit of now bordering a very angry NATO member. Because unlike Estonia or perhaps Finland, where the border has seen fighting 80 years ago last, that would be a border that you achieved by fighting through a neutral country that they were helping. It will be a different border. So consider it a little unlikely that they're aiming for Odessa, and considering it very likely that they're aiming to take east of the Dnieper and then challenge Kharkiv. That's my projection on what they're doing. So thank you for watching. I will be going to purchase an energy drink. Good day.